Let's now take a look at the proposed schedule of topics that we'll be covering week by week. And I should mention that this is subject to revision. This is just a good approximation of where we go. I could very well change it during the course of the semester, depending on the interest of students. And if I'm finding that you're having difficulty, students in general having difficulty with certain subjects, I might spend more time on that and less on other topics, or maybe take some other out of the curriculum. So here we are. We're in the first week. We've done introductions because we've gotten this far. We've talked about the trolley example, and we're now talking about the course requirements. So that's what we're going to finish up with this week. At the beginning of next week, I actually left something off. We're going to be talking about something related to what you need to do to and what you can do in order to improve your educational skills, your intellectual skills, something I call mindsets, or actually the author who's come up with this idea has is called it that. Then you're also going to be this week watching the movie Wall Street, and we're going to talk about capitalism and socialism. And finally, we will be talking about what philosophy is. I'm going to give you an introduction to philosophy and what philosophy has to do with ethics. And that might very well flow into the next week. But in the next week, we're going to finish up on those subjects and then talk about ethical problems that arise in business. And we want to talk about micro and macro problems. And we're also going to start talking about the role of arguments, moral arguments, in the discussion of ethical problems in business. In week 4, we're going to move to the question, and it's an age old question in philosophy, why anybody ought to be moral. Why should you be concerned about morality? In particular, we're going to read a little bit out of Plato's Republic, a particular example that's known as the Ring of Gyges example, in which he raises that very fundamental issue. That is, why should anybody be moral? What's the benefit to it, or is there any benefit? And we're going to then discuss Wall Street, the movie, in that context. And we will also, in parallel, be spending a little bit more time understanding what arguments are and what their role is in solving ethical issues. From there, we're going to move on to week 5, where we're going to be learning how to evaluate arguments. We're going to start looking at the movie Disclosure, and in particular, the issues that it raises with regard to sexual harassment, and sexual harassment in particular in the business environment. Interesting topic. And finally, as we get to week 6, we'll have some exercises related to arguments, understanding arguments, and evaluating arguments. We'll do some review, and we probably get the midterm assigned at that point. Uh, this is probably a pretty optimistic schedule, so we might not get up to everything, and you'll probably have the midterm. Maybe you'll have the other week in week 7 to get it completed. Okay, in week 7, we'll talk about ethical arguments and moral theories. What does one have to do with the other? And how do they fit together? And we'll actually be talking about moral theories in general. And then we'll spend a little bit more time talking about consequentialism or utilitarianism, which is a moral theory that's been proposed where to decide whether a certain thing is right or a certain action is right or wrong, you look at the ends, what the action accomplishes, what its consequences are. That's why it's called consequentialism. And I'll explain why it's called utilitarianism. And the claim of this theory is that the ends that are accomplished are what justifies the action itself. From there, in week 8, we'll start moving on to talk about whistleblowing in the tobacco industry. And particularly, you'll start watching a movie, and we'll talk about loyalty, truth, trust, and we'll talk about the whistleblower. And we'll also move from there into the fat man example, uh, or the fat man example from the trolley examples. And we're going to talk about the other kind of theory, the deontological theory, And basically, that theory says that there are certain things that, no matter what the consequences are, there are certain things that are right or wrong. There are certain rules defining what your duties, what your obligations are. And then we'll have a discussion of the insider, even though we saw it before, with respect to this and deciding, and we'll try to apply both utilitarianism and deontology and see what are the consequences there. We'll then in week 10 move on to talk about socialism and capitalism, probably going back to talk a little bit about Wall Street again, the movie, and we'll talk about some concepts of socialism, what they call surplus profit. We'll talk about the varying views of property and the morality having to do with property ownership in these two different systems. And we'll talk about business finance and the stock market in the context of capitalism. In week 11, we'll move on to a very specific issue that's raised in Wall Street, having to do, in the movie Wall Street, that is, having to do with insider trading. If you don't know what that is, I hope you know some who've at least heard about trading trading stocks. That is, stocks are just an ownership interest in companies, and that's what goes on Wall Street. Very big business in New York, something you should at least know a little bit about and understand what the business is. And in that context, we'll also talk about another moral theory, probably the most dominant one, the one people most subscribe to, and I think it's the one that has the least plausibility, namely relativism. And we'll talk maybe a little bit about social contract theory and morality. And in week 12, we will be moving on to coming to some conclusions about how we should proceed with regard to moral problems in business and society. And we will conduct a review, and after that, we will have the final exam.